Let us look at how we can manage environmental relations. The content of the environmental relations section consists of the following. We discuss why the environment is important in business, what some of the environment-related problems are. Then we discuss key concepts involved in environmental relations, and we give tools for managing the environment, including stakeholder management tools. Why is the environment important in business? Well, a system cannot exist in isolation from its environment. If the environment changes, the system will have to adapt. We all know that when we go on holiday, if we go into the mountains where there's snow, we have to have different gear than if we go into the tropics. Likewise, if the business environment of an organization changes, a new technology comes on the market, making their own products obsolete, or a new competitor entering the market, the business will have to change accordingly. And the change in the system must mirror in magnitude the change in the environment. There's a systemic law, the so-called law of requisite variety by Ashby, which expresses that. So the more fundamental the change is in the environment, the more fundamental the change in the business must be. Sometimes we hear, why must we change so much? The reason for that is because we need to match the environmental change. A system is co-produced by its environment. As new technologies are coming on the market in the environment, they will co-produce new product development in the organization, for example. Likewise, a system co-produces change in its environment. If an organization comes up with an innovative product, it sets a new example in the market and it will change the market. Systems can also deliberately cause changes in the environment if they get together with their stakeholders and they can collectively change the environment. What we would like to have now is that the various financial institutions would get together and co-produce a financial environment that is more beneficial to the economy and that does not deliver finance crises as we have seen in the past and may see in the future. What are typically environmental related problems? Well, there is lack of awareness of new developments in both the contextual, in other words, the wider environment, and the transactional environment, that is the environment which contains the stakeholders. Many organizations fail to do proper environmental scanning and are not aware of new developments in their environment and are overtaken by them. Many organizations neglect their inner environment. They are very aware of what is happening externally, but what is happening with respect to their staff and their immediate environment, they are not aware of. They tend to be not the employers of choice if they neglect their inner environment. Some organizations neglect their stakeholder interests. They plan and fail to consider stakeholders. As a result, stakeholders will not support what the organization wants to achieve. Another typical example is making changes but failing to communicate to stakeholders, or to make changes that are in conflict with stakeholders in the environment. Another typical problem is that an organization ignores the impact that the system has on the environment, be it pollutants or negative effects on the market or on customers, for example. Some organizations do not interpret the environmental changes correctly. They do not explore their own assumptions and assumptions associated with the impact, and they react wrongly as a result of that. And many systems do not attempt to co-produce a desirable environment for itself and its stakeholders. In the context of supply chains, be it internal supply chain in an organization or industry supply chains. The failure to understand developments in one part of the supply chain could affect the whole supply chain and therefore the part. For example, technological developments in the energy sector could affect other sub-industries in the energy sector, or developments in the IT industry could affect some parts of an internal supply chain and therefore impact on the supply chain as a whole. Systems interact with their environment. As I mentioned, systems are impacted on by their environment, or as we previously said, co-produced by their environment. Like a change in market forces changes the system, and the system needs to understand its environment in order to be able to make the appropriate responses. And secondly, the system itself impacts on its environment or co-produces the environment, and it has to be very careful how it does so. For example, we need to be very aware how we are impacting collectively on the planet. We need to understand that systems have a transactional environment and a contextual environment. That distinction between transactional environment and contextual environment is one of the degree of control that the system has over its environment. Now let me explain that a little more. So the system has a transactional environment. In other words, some parts of the environment the system is in transaction with. The organization transacts with its suppliers, its customers, its staff. And in that transaction, the system is able to influence its environment. So that part of the environment that we can influence is called the transactional environment. Then we are all part of an environment that we cannot influence. For example, we cannot influence the weather pattern, we cannot influence the legislative processes of our country, we cannot change the tax laws. So those are all stakeholders, the receiver of revenue, for example, who are in the contextual environment. And the behavior of the system vis-à-vis those different environments is different. We have to adapt to the contextual environment. So if the contextual environment changes, we have to adapt. In the case of the transactional environment, we can exert influence. And the more we can influence our transactional environment to benefit us as a system, the easier it will be for us to develop. The boundaries between those two environments are not fixed. If we come together as an industry, for example, if all organizations within an industry will try to change some tax laws or some tax regulations concerning that industry, it is possible that they could influence the receiver of revenue. So then we are pushing the boundaries of the transactional environment into the contextual environment. In other words, what was previously contextual environment that we couldn't control or influence, we can in the end influence. But we can't do that as an individual system, we can only do it as a collective. So related systems have to club together and try to exert influence together. This is typically what is done in a lobby. Another distinction is that systems have an outer environment and an inner environment. We are typically seeing the system having an outer environment. And when we talk about our customers or the receiver of revenue or the planet, that is typically the outer environment we refer to, but very often we forget that we also have an inner environment. The concept of the inner environment is not very well developed in the systems literature, because typically we believe that the inner environment is part of the system. This is not true. And I need to explain the distinction, what is part of the system and what is part of the inner environment. We have learned in a previous module about the systems hierarchy that societies contain individuals, individuals contain cells, cells contain atoms, and so on. So those entities, the atoms, are the inner environment of the cells are the inner environment of the person, the individuals are the inner environment of society. Now, what are the parts then of society or the individual or the cell? The parts of those systems are the functions. So, for example, my body has different functions, a motor function, a circulatory function. Those functions are the parts of the organism. They make up what we call the organism. And they are there staying an inherent part of the system as long as the system exists. Now, the cells of the body populate those functions, and the cells come and go, as we know, every few weeks, months, or years, depending on the kind of cell tissue or cells we're talking about. The cells in our body change, but we look in our organism more or less the same like we looked a few weeks or a couple of months ago, apart from aging. So the cells come and go, the functions remain as long as the systems remain. The same is true in an organization. An organization has a marketing function, a financial function, a production function, etc. They are the inherent parts of the system. The organization is developing or emerging from the interaction of those functions. And as long as the organization exists, those functions exist. Now, in the course of time, different individuals are populating those functions. So the individuals come and go, but the functional part remains. So the difference is the system itself, and the functions are the parts of the system, and the persons that render a service in terms of one of those functions belong to the inner environment of the system. And they are entity systems in their own rights, and they have their own functions, some of which they deploy for an organization. Some of them they deploy at other entity systems. So this is an important distinction. Now, the system develops from the co-production of its outer and inner environment. So I, as a person, develop according to how my environment changes and how my inner cellular and molecular atomic environment changes, and how I myself am changing as a person. And this is illustrated by the self-reflective circle. So I'm around my ethos field. How I change according to the changes in the environment depends on me. So if I'm feeling thirsty or hungry now, that is a prompter from my inner cellular environment, I will reflect. Should I now have a glass of water, or should I later have a glass of water? If the light changes out there, I will reflect. Should I stop talking now? Should we switch on the light now, or should we do it later? So the co-production of the system in the middle, me as a person, depends on how my outer environment changes, my inner environment changes, and how I react to those changes. And that reaction requires self-reflection. Now we can look in more detail at the outer and inner environment in terms of the control I have. So I can distinguish, as we said earlier, a transactional environment and contextual environment. So I have an outer transactional environment and an outer contextual environment. You are part of my outer transactional environment. I can influence you through what I say and how I say it. The outer contextual environment, your government, for example, I cannot influence. Likewise, we have an inner transactional environment and an inner contextual environment. If I'm looking at myself as a person, my inner transactional environment are my cells in the body. I can influence them. How can I influence them? Well, depending what I eat, what I drink, through exercise, through supplementation, through rest or stress, I can influence my cellular environment. So they are part of my transactional environment. I'm not able to change the genetic structure in the nucleus of my cells, or I'm not able to directly change the atomic structure of my cells, the viruses that inhabit the inner environment. So they are part of my contextual environment. Now, if we are looking at an organization, the persons that are employed by the organization are part of the inner transactional environment. The organization can influence them. They can't fully control them, but they can influence them through various methodologies. The inner environment of the employees, the inner contextual environment, how they manage stress, their diseases, or their family life, that is part of the inner contextual environment of the organization. They cannot control that. They can only control or try and influence it through the transactional environment. If they have the cooperation of the employees, they can lobby, so to speak, that the employee is changing their health habit, for argument's sake. So the system emerges in the middle from the co-production of the outer and inner transactional and contextual environment. In other words, the organization develops differently if it tries to actively manage its outer and inner transactional environment and the way it adapts to its outer contextual and inner contextual environment. Systems also have stakeholders. The definition of the stakeholder roughly is a system that is impacted on by the system of focus, or a system that impacts on our system of focus. The stakeholder is typically a functional concept. If I give the example, in the public sector one often hears the community is a stakeholder. Well, the community is a stakeholder in a functional perspective. So, for example, the community as parents of children are stakeholders in education, or the aged have a stake in the healthcare system, which is different than the young members of a community who also have a stake in healthcare, which may be slightly different. So there's a functional perspective. If I'm looking at another organization being a stakeholder, it is either a stakeholder as a customer or as a competitor or as an organization that has to do with regulation, etc. What is important about stakeholders is that stakeholders appoint themselves. What we mean by that is that we cannot ignore our stakeholders. If a person or organization says they're a stakeholder of my system, I have to accept that, if I like it or not. Sometimes it would be convenient for an organization to say, for example, the ecological lobbies are not their stakeholders, but they are. The reason why this is important is that stakeholders who are not considered can do the system a lot of damage by not supporting it or working against it. So it is better to understand who the stakeholders are and interact with them and strive for creating a win-win between the system and its stakeholders. The stakeholders are systems within the environment, and consequently we can distinguish outer stakeholders and inner stakeholders. In some situations that are wider, we can also say the self, my system itself, is a stakeholder of itself. So we can distinguish between stakeholders in the outer environment, stakeholders in the inner environment, like the staff members of a system, or the cells in my body are stakeholders of my body, and then I myself can be a stakeholder in a particular issue.
Another organizing principle of the environment is that it is multidimensional. This means that we can classify the environment into different categories. We use the classifications of a political, economic, cultural, psychological environment, and a technological environment, ecological, biological, physiological, physical. Other categories are less differentiated. A famous one is the PESTE categorization, which stands for political, economic, social, technological, ecological, or there's the PESTEL, which is the same plus legal added, which in our case would be part of the political environment. It is not so important which particular categorization one uses as long as it serves the purposes of the organization. What is important is that each activity system belongs to a particular dimension. For example, an entity system like a society would have economic, political, cultural, ecological, technological, etc. activities. Likewise, an entity system like a person would have economic, political, cultural activities. It would also have psychological activity systems and physiological activity systems like nutrition, exercising, and then various physical and biological activity systems. This makes an entity system multidimensional. At the same time, each of the activity systems of an entity system is multidimensional in itself. That means it reflects other dimensions. So, for example, my economic activity of working has a psychological dimension. There's a particular psychological aspect to work, a particular culture that reflects that work, its own economic dimension and its political dimension, and it has a technological dimension, and it has impact on the ecology, physiology, biology, and so on. So each activity system reflects some or all of the other dimensions, making it multidimensional also. Now, what are the tools for managing the environment? The first tool is environmental scanning. In other words, we have to look at the environment and see what is changing so that we can take adaptive action. We forecast trends, we look at discontinuities in the environment, we try to anticipate what is changing in the environment, and we are looking at the multidimensional perspectives of the environment. We are looking at economic, cultural changes, political changes, technological changes, ecological, physical,
psychological, physiological, etc., depending what is appropriate in terms of our system. There are different approaches in trying to understand how the environment changes. We can scan or we can search. Scanning the environment means we look in overview what is changing, while a search means we look specifically at what it is changing. So we already have a particular issue in mind that we want to know more about. That is typically a search. So either scanning or searching in a multidimensional way and anticipating changes is very important for the system to be able to take action that responds appropriately to the environment. Many organizations have had negative experiences or nearly went out of business because they did not scan the environment properly. They did not anticipate particular technological developments, for example, or changes in the marketplace, and as a result could not adapt themselves to it. Another tool is strategic issue analysis. So once I have looked at the environment and what is changing, my next question is that change a strategic issue for my system? Is it of importance? What is or what is not important about that issue that I have identified? Why is it important if I choose to say that issue is important? So one of the methodologies that is used here is assumption surfacing. In other words, we look at what are the assumptions that I have, so that I'm saying this trend or this development is important for my system. Another important tool is impact analysis. What is the impact of that environmental change on my system? So once I have identified something is a strategic issue, what is its impact? And it can be the impact of the environment on the system. I could also look at what is the impact that I have on the environment. So both methodologies are covered by impact analysis. For example, what is the ecological impact of my production? What is the impact on the planet? And questions I'm asking here is, what is the nature of the impact? How does it impact? When does it impact? What type of impact is there? Etc. So those are different questions I can ask to assess the impact and to help me define a strategy to deal with the impact. And we can take various insights that we gain from environmental scanning and strategic issue and impact analysis together and group related issues into scenarios and use that for coming up with appropriate strategies. We can distinguish between contextual scenarios, that are scenarios that are generic. For example, what is the likely energy situation going to do in the next 20 years and how does it impact on us? Or there can be specific planning scenarios that I'm looking at. I look at specific information that is of importance for me, and I'm looking at how could that information be different according to different scenarios and how does that affect my strategy. Let us look at the tools we have to manage stakeholders. First of all, I need to identify my stakeholders. What is the definition of a stakeholder? A stakeholder is a system that has an interest in my system or the system under consideration. Stakeholder is a functional concept. So we are looking for different functions that have an interest in the system that we are looking at. If we're looking, for example, at the education system, who are the stakeholders of the education system? That would be the parents, the teachers, the pupils, the Department of Education, and maybe a few others. It doesn't matter how many a stakeholder group consists of in terms of membership. As a function, each stakeholder is equally important to make education work, even if the school principal is only one person and the teachers are a few, the students are many, and the parents are even more than the students. So in terms of decision making, it is important to understand that we need to plan an education system in such a way that the interest of each of the stakeholder groups is being met, never mind how many there are. Stakeholders appoint themselves. That is a very important concept. We cannot ignore the stakeholders of our system. So if some functional group comes and says, we have a stake, we are a stakeholder in what you're doing, then the system better takes cognizance of that. An example of that was many organizations tried to ignore the environmental lobbies for a long time, but they couldn't, because they have appointed themselves as stakeholders and they made their voices heard. An important tool to deal with stakeholders is stakeholder analysis. Stakeholder analysis means answering the question, what is the stake that a stakeholder has in my system or the issue under consideration? In other words, what interests do they have? What are their expectations, or what problems do they have with my system? What can be done about that? Likewise, we can look at stakeholder analysis. What is my interest, my stake in my stakeholder? So, for example, an organization would analyze what is the stake of the customers, the suppliers, shareholders, etc. in the organization. But one could also say what interest has the organization in the shareholder, in the customer, and so on. Sometimes it is useful to evaluate the importance of stakeholders. And the importance depends on whatever criteria need to be looked at, or what criteria are of importance in a different situation. For example, an organization may want to evaluate its various stakeholders in terms of the power that the stakeholder has over the organization and the degree of satisfaction that each stakeholder has with the organization. Are they satisfied with my organization? Yes or no? And are they having a lot of power over me? Yes or no? So we can look at low power versus high power stakeholder, and we can ask, is the stakeholder satisfied? So in other words, low satisfaction or high satisfaction with what I'm doing. And then I am evaluating each stakeholder in terms of those, and I'm plotting them in the according boxes. Which are my critical stakeholders? Well, obviously, the critical stakeholders are those that have high power over what I'm doing, but they are not satisfied with what I'm doing. While the stakeholders that have high power over me and are already satisfied with what I'm doing, I have to focus to keep them continuously satisfied. So having done the evaluation and identified that there are some stakeholders that are critical, it is of course important for the organization to take action. Another important stakeholder tool is stakeholder planning. What that means is that any non-routine decision that a system makes needs to involve a stakeholder analysis. So whenever something is being decided, it is useful to say, who are the stakeholders, what would they want from the decision, and then we make a decision in such a way that as much as possible we satisfy our stakeholders. Stakeholder communication is another important tool. So once we have made a decision, we need to communicate it. And stakeholder communication means that I'm communicating what each stakeholder needs to know and when they need to know it. Not more, not less information. It is deadly for a system in the information age to CC every report to everybody in the name of transparency and thereby overloading the system. It takes a little more time to make a decision what is exactly what each stakeholder needs and to communicate to a particular stakeholder that that decision was made, what it means for you is that and that and that. If you want to know more, we gladly send you the whole report. If the stakeholder planning phase was done well, stakeholder analysis was done well, then we know what every stakeholder wants, and deciding what we need to communicate to them is not so difficult.
Another stakeholder management tool is to deal with stakeholder interaction as a multidimensional exchange. So, for example, if we look at your project or your function, you can provide multidimensional value through your project or function to your client. In reverse, you can also explore the contribution that you get back from the client in terms of different dimensions and see if through the multidimensionality of the mutual contributions, the interchange between you and your stakeholders cannot be enriched and improved and more developed.
Sometimes a stakeholder has expectations that we cannot fulfill, so it would be useful to look at other values that we could give them. We could look, for example, at the economic exchange between the seller and the buyer of an organization. Now, if we look at that exchange during the industrial age, what was typical was that a seller gives products or services to a buyer, and in exchange for that, the buyer provides money. Now, when we come to an information age organization, that exchange obviously is still valid. We have seller and a buyer, so the seller provides goods and or services and the buyer pays money. But there is more that the seller can give. The seller can give additional value. Besides the goods and services, they can provide a friendly service, they can provide after-sales service, they can provide image that goes with the service, or the assurance that the production is green, or whatever the additional value is that the seller can provide, for which the buyer is prepared to pay more money. Besides giving money, the buyer could provide also other value to the seller. For example, loyalty. Carrying on buying the brand of the seller continuously because a past exchange has been happy. And the seller may well be prepared to pay money to the buyer for that additional value. For example, discount for loyalty. Then we can have a situation where the buyer provides some goods and services to the seller. For example, I have worked with an organization that built plants for mines and refineries, and the buyer had technology which the seller wanted to use, and not only use for that plant but for other plants later on. So in exchange, the seller gave the buyer money. So what we have here is a multi-dimensional exchange, and what we can look at is what does my stakeholder want, what can I give the stakeholder, what can I get from the stakeholder, and we can look at that exchange in a multifold way and develop the relationship accordingly. Obviously, the more exchange we've got, the more developed our relationship is. Likewise, in a relationship between friends or spouses or other parties, there is multidimensional exchange that can take place. Another important tool is stakeholder education. This is especially important if the system cannot satisfy an important stakeholder, a need or expectation, and the system needs to explain to the stakeholder why they cannot do so, and literally educate them in the reason. So if a system tries to satisfy the stakeholder but can't, then they need to educate them, and most stakeholders are not unreasonable.
Other stakeholder management tools are concerned with enrolling stakeholders and creating alignment amongst them. The most basic is stakeholder consideration. That means if I'm planning something, I need to consider the stakeholders. What do they expect or want, or how are they impacted on by that decision I'm planning or that design I'm planning? This does not necessarily involve direct interaction if I know what the stakeholder wants. And if I build those needs and wants into the design, they will be supporting of that design or of that decision and align with it. Another tool is stakeholder consultation. I'm directly interacting with a stakeholder in order to find out what they want, what their needs, expectations are, or how they would be impacted on by my decision or design or strategy. If I manage to make a decision that meets with their expectations, they will be enrolled and aligned with it. Another tool is stakeholder co-design. This means that I involve the stakeholders directly in co-designing the decision or the plan or the strategy or the design. So there's more input and synergy created between me and my stakeholders if we co-design. There's likely to be new outcomes and emergence for both the stakeholder and the system involving the stakeholders. So it is more creative than the previous two tools. So depending on the type of decision I have to make or the type of design or plan or strategy I'm considering, I'm using one or all of those tools.
Let us now look at the application of the environment in an activity and entity system. The environmental perspective in an activity system emphasizes continuity, namely that systems link up with other systems in their environment and that they exchange MEI, that stands for matter, energy and information, with each other. Or put differently, the MEI continues to flow from one system to another along supply chains. For example, if the orange arrow represents the business process of my organization, then there's an upstream link to our suppliers and a downstream link to our clients. And of course, the whole industry exists within an overarching activity system that we often call an industry or a public institution or a function. If there are changes associated with our suppliers and customers, as well as the industry as a whole, then obviously our orange system is affected by this and needs to respond to those changes. There's still another link to be considered, namely that to the system that taps the byproducts of our processing.
This is part of a different industry. Often this type of continuity into the environment is forgotten and is a major cofactor in the unsustainability of systems. Let us now look a little bit in more detail into the environment, both contextual and transactional, of an activity system supply chain. We have the orange shape representing the contextual environment and changes within the contextual environment, which, as we have heard, are multidimensional. They could be technological, economic, political, cultural, ecological, etc. The stakeholders in the transactional environment, what we heard in the previous slide, are suppliers and the clients of the products and services, as well as the byproducts of our activity system. There are other stakeholders in the transactional and contextual environment, like the industry regulators, which prescribe governance to an activity system. There are also competitors who have similar activity systems. Then there is the organization as a whole, of which the activity system is part, which has an important influence on the activity system. So if there are changes in the aims or the culture or the governance of the organization, this will impact on the activity system. And then there's the containing function. In other words, if the activity system I'm looking at is a sub-function, for example, in human resources, one of the sub-functions is often the administration of employees. So if I'm looking at the administration sub-function, then any changes in the containing function of human resources as a whole would be an important impact. So HR, the containing activity system, is a stakeholder. Then there will be other functions in the organization. So, for example, if the IT system is changing, then my HR system will change, if that is the system of my focus. Or if the finance system changes its rules and regulations, then all the activity systems of the organization have to comply by that. So other functions in the organization are also stakeholders. Then we have stakeholders in the inner environment. Those are the individual members and teams that are part of the activity system that I look at. And the activity system management represents the activity system itself. So that is the level of the self. We've learned that the environment of a system is multidimensional. This is also true for the activity system. So if you're looking at an activity system as a whole, for example, the energy industry, then it is multidimensional. That means it has an economic, a political, a cultural, ecological, a health, etc. dimension. If you're looking at the sub-industries within the larger industry, for example, the renewable and non-renewable industries, as exemplified by maybe the renewable by the solar energy and the non-renewable by the coal energy, each of those sub-industries is also multidimensional, has economic, political, cultural, etc. dimensions. Now, if there's a change of significance in one of the dimensions, in one of the sub-industries, this can have repercussions to the other sub-industries and the industry as a whole. For example, as solar industries developed better technologies, cheaper technologies, it became more and more feasible to have them phased into the overarching industry. Or ecological development, like the Fukushima disaster, had an impact on the way non-renewable energy, especially nuclear energy, is being perceived.
And some countries like Germany with their Energiewende have made the decision to replace nuclear energy. So this has repercussions on the other players to provide that kind of energy that is falling away by closing the nuclear power stations. So a change in the environment in one of the subphases can have tremendous impact on the other phases. And this is one of the reasons why we need to look at supply chains as a whole and have also knowledge repositories, maybe at the level of government, of the multidimensional changes that could affect a whole industry and each sub-industry, because it can have impacts on the planning of the industry as a whole. Besides the multidimensionality of the environment, each activity system and its sub-activity systems also has an outer and inner environment. There could be developments in the inner environment of an industry, a sub-industry, or a subsection in an internal supply chain that can affect the supply chain as a whole. For example, if there are corrupt employees. A recent Volkswagen scandal of falsifying data had repercussions for the whole almost industry, but certainly the supply chain of Volkswagen itself and the whole organization of Volkswagen. So those were developments in the inner environment that can be very powerful. I have given already some examples in the outer environment with Fukushima or technological developments, etc. There are, of course, also possible changes in contextual and transactional environment of the industry as a whole and each of its sub-industries, and I have mentioned these examples under the multidimensional and inner environment, which of course are associated with different stakeholders. Another way of depicting the same issue that we said earlier is we have an activity system. It is multidimensional, illustrated by the orange lines, and it has a transactional outer and a transactional inner environment. Transactional outer environment would be the specific stakeholders of that particular activity systems. Transactional inner environment would be the specific team members, for example, of that activity system or sub-functions of that activity system. And then we have the outer contextual and the inner contextual environment. We have not spoken yet about the inner contextual environment. An example could be, some years ago I worked in an African country with an organization which had huge problems because a particular section of its staff which had to travel throughout the country all had AIDS and died. So the inner environment of the members of the organization, the cellular environment of the members of the organization represent the inner contextual environment, and it can have impact on an activity system. If we summarize what we have said about the mutual impact of the environment and a system, we can say that the development in the environment of an activity system or a sub-activity system in any dimension of the environment, in either its outer or inner environment or its contextual or transactional environment, can have an effect on the whole entity system, that means the whole organization, or the overarching containing activity system, in other words the supply chain, or also it could impact on another activity system within the organizational entity or in the outer or inner environment.
Looking at the environmental perspective of an entity system, we need to remember that entity systems consist of bundles of outward, inward and self-directed activity systems.
Each of those activity systems links the entity to different parts in its environment. And each activity system interacts with its own function-specific environment. This could be interacting with an outer environment, like in the case of the business function, or it could also mean that the activity system interacts with its inner environment, like some business support or organization support functions, where the suppliers and the clients are within the organization. Also, each activity system is associated with a different dimension. For example, in a building organization, the business process links into the building industry. At the same time, business support functions like structural engineering, electrical engineering, construction, plumbing, painting, etc. have their own specialized industries they link into, as do the organizational functions like corporate finance, IT, HR, legal, and so on. Any new development within those specialized industries is not only important to the relevant function, but it could also potentially threaten the entity system as a whole, like the whole organization, or it could contribute to an improved development of the whole. It is also important to remember that each activity system within the entity system is multidimensional in itself. Again, any new development in any dimension of a specific activity system or function could be a threat or opportunity not only to the activity system but to the entity system as a whole. If you're looking at the environment of an organization, which is an entity system, then we have to look at the environment from the threefold perspective of entity systems. We have learned that entity systems consist of outward-directed, inward-directed, and self-directed activity systems. Now, each of those activity systems have their own environment. They are linking into their own specific industry. The outward-directed functions or activity systems of the organization are typically the business activity systems. They provide the products and services for clients in the environment. Each of those business systems have their own inner and outer contextual and transactional environment. So, for example, if I have an organization that produces two types of products or services, then each product and each service has its own specific clients. That means its own stakeholders in the transactional environment. They may have their own suppliers, they may have their own regulation. From an organizational point of view and a business point of view, we will have an overarching industry that also has its own more generic environment, both outer environment and inner environment, contextual and transactional. Again, the outer environment pertains to other systems in the outer environment of the activity system. The inner environment would be the members of the team, etc. And the contextual environment are broad changes in the environment that would affect every business in the industry, and the transactional environment is specific to the industry. So it's pertaining to the market niche that the industry, that the business represents. The self-directed functions of an organization have to do with organizing the organization itself, that is typically administration, finance, HR, and these various support services. Each of those have their own industry, and they have to understand the industry environment, because if something is changing, for example, in labor law, it will affect the organization as a whole through the activity system called human resource management. So again, these systems have an outer-inner environment and their own specific stakeholders in the contextual and in the transactional environment. What is maybe also noteworthy is that the organization development functions are pretty similar across industries. So, for example, if there is a new tax law in a country, that will affect the finance and audit, etc. departments of every organization. So they would be the same for the self-directed functions of all organizations. The inward-directed functions have to do with the different phases of the production of goods and services of the business activity systems. They are also industry specific to some extent. So if I'm in the car industry, all cars have paint shops, so any new development in the paint industry, for example, would be affecting all organizations in that industry. But there could be specific technological developments that some have and others don't have, which would be more the transactional environment of the inward-directed function. What is important when we do environmental scanning in an entity system is that we are looking at the business as a whole, which is the combined outward-directed activity systems of the business, and see what changes there in the industry, that we are looking at each business unit specifically, and that we are also looking at each of the activity systems, the self-directed and the inward-directed, and explore their specific environment from the point of view of that function providing a good service, but also from the perspective of this function making a contribution to the business development of the organization. For example, developments in the IT industry have changed the way goods and services are produced or are sold, and they have come, or they have co-created completely new business models for different organizations. So it's very important that each function looks at its impact on the organization as a whole. If we summarize what we have said just now, the outward-directed activity systems of an organization represent the actual business of the organization. In other words, the kind of products and services it contributes to the environment. We have also said that environmental change can change the business. And this change can come from any part of the organization within, it can come from the external or the internal environment. The inward and self-directed activity systems of an organization are similar across all industries. We have also said they can contribute to the development of the business as well as the organization. And the activity systems themselves are influenced by the nature of the business of the organization. In other words, depending on the kind of products and services the organization delivers or the kind of industry it is part of, it can influence its own inner or self-directed activity systems. If you're looking now, how do we entrench environmental management in a learning organization, then we need to consider that the organization as a whole is part of an industry and has its industry environment. And as we said, each function and sub-function also has its own specific environment. And we need to make sure that that knowledge associated with the environmental changes in each function and the organization as a whole are entrenched in knowledge repositories. And also in procedures that are the same throughout the organization, so that we don't have some functions of the organization that look well after the environment and others that are neglectful of it. So we need to standardize. So systemic management involves that each function and sub-functions needs to understand its own environment in order to be effective itself and contribute to business and organization development. So we need to have standardized procedures throughout the organization that we make sure that each function asks the right question, has the same kind of approach to environmental scanning, and also records the outcomes of an environmental scan in knowledge repositories. So, environmental management throughout the organization follows standardized templates and standardized procedures. And the environmental management that comes up after each environmental scanning session is related and stored in knowledge repositories. And each time there's a new environmental session and new environmental information is identified, it is added to the existing knowledge in the repositories, and knowledge that was in the repositories and is not relevant anymore is being deleted. In other words, we need to update after each strategic meeting the knowledge repositories. Thereby we can make sure that the understanding of the environment in all parts of the organization, in all its functions, is up to date at any one time.